For more insight on the humanitarian implications of the Israel-Hamas war, we're joined by Ravina Shamdasani. She is the chief spokesperson of the UN Human Rights Office. Ms. Shamdasani, we began this bulletin about half an hour ago with confirmation that the only power provider in the Gaza Strip has shut down. So we're looking at an area that even before Saturday, we had a 95% with no access to clean drinking water, and half do not have enough to eat. So now, without electricity and the running of basic services, what are we looking out for in the next few days and the next few weeks in the Gaza Strip?
As you rightly point out, the humanitarian situation for the people of Gaza was dire and very difficult even before Saturday. Since then, they've been bombarded, they're subjected to violence of all sorts, and the declaration by the Israelis of a complete siege on Gaza, this could amount to collective punishment, which is very clearly prohibited under international humanitarian law. We are looking at a really difficult situation for the people on the ground. As you know, the access to safe water, it implies a lot of other rights as well, the right to adequate sanitation. The lack of clean water can facilitate the spread of diseases. We are looking at a very difficult situation, and we are calling on the Israeli authorities to refrain from any kind of collective punishment on the people of Gaza.
Ms. Shamdasani, does humanitarian law, is it equally salient, potent during wartime? And even if it is, can it be executed? Is there any way to enforce it to ensure that humanitarian laws are followed even during a war?
It is very important to understand that international humanitarian law is the law of war. These were laws that were crafted precisely for such situations to ensure that even in the conduct of hostilities, there are certain actions that are entirely prohibited. The civilian population must be spared. All steps must be taken to ensure that they are not killed, injured, that essential civilian infrastructure is not hit, and certainly not targeted. These are laws that were exactly drafted and crafted for such situations. And it's also very important to understand that non-compliance by one party does not excuse the other party. There is an obligation on all sides, no matter what, in any circumstance, to respect international humanitarian law.
I'll be a devil's advocate here, and I realize these laws are put in place with very good intentions, but wars are necessarily destructive. For example, you want to demoralize a local population, you want to sap the military force of your opponent. These things you want to achieve, whatever the cost to you, whatever the cost to your international reputation. What place does international law have if you are trying to fight and win a war?
You can have legitimate military operations and legitimate military targets. What is entirely forbidden is the targeting of civilians. Here, let's put this in perspective. There's an armed group. There are a couple of armed groups, including Hamas, that carried out attacks against Israeli civilians. The Israeli government is fighting back, launching a military operation. This military operation needs to target the military, the armed groups on the other side. It cannot target innocent civilians, women, children, and men who have nothing to do with this war. That should be a fundamental principle in humanity that we can all agree on, that innocent civilians should not be targeted. And these are precisely, as I said, these are the laws of war. They're not kind of naive, idealistic constructions, for world peace. These are laws that apply specifically in times of war to prevent catastrophe for civilians.
All right, Palestinian authorities have said...
We've been down this road many times before. We've been down this road many times before. And especially in the Israeli-Palestinian context, we have seen that, rampant violations of international humanitarian law, they don't lead to long-term peace or security for the people. It's misguided.
Now, we've had the Palestinian Foreign Ministry coming out to say more than 22,000 residential units destroyed, 10 health facilities and 48 schools have been destroyed. And this is about 24 hours ago since Saturday. Is it realistic to expect that you can carry out a blanket bombing campaign and not spare schools, hospitals, residential units? These things, they're fine calculations that an army may not take into account when it's trying to decimate a population.
These are exactly the kind of calculations that the army is required to take into account. There are specific legitimate military targets that can be hit. But whenever you are assessing whether or not a strike is legal, you need to assess whether it's going to have a disproportionate impact on civilians. Otherwise, the strike is illegal and it amounts to a war crime. So these calculations are very important to make in any attempt at targeting military facilities on the other side.
Okay, final question here, Ms. Shamdasani. First, very short on the next few days, how to tide the civilian population through in Gaza Strip with the total cutoff in power, and looking ahead, perhaps persuading Israel to lift its full siege on the region, at least to allow some supplies to go in. What are the immediate steps we can think of doing? Very quickly, final question.
A humanitarian corridor needs to be created for safe passage of civilians and of goods that are essential to their survival. The violence needs to stop. People need to come to the negotiating table, and all attempts at incitement to hatred and violence need to cease. This is a time for cooler heads, for the lowering of temperatures, ultimately for the security and human rights of people on both sides. A further escalation will serve no one.
Thanks so much for joining us this evening. Ravina Shamdasani speaking to us live from Geneva.